The year is 1215 in medieval England. Meet King John I, the ruler of England at the time. He isolated his 12-year-old wife from society, may or may not have killed his nephew, and overtaxed all of his people. And if you couldn't pay, he'd just take possession of your house. So it was to be expected when his own people rebelled against his tyranny. Once the barons finally cornered him, they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was ratified on June 15th, 1215. But first, what exactly is the Magna Carta? To summarize, the Magna Carta was a contract that gave any free man their own individual rights. It also put any monarch under the law. It's basically like the predecessor of the laws we know and love today. Here's a law from the Magna Carta that lasts to this very day. No free man shall be arrested or imprisoned except by judgment of their equals and by the law of the land. To no one we will sell, to no one we will deny or delay right or justice. This meant that King John could no longer do whatever he wanted. He too had to follow the law. Unfortunately, peasants and serfs weren't considered free men, but rather property of their landowners. The Pope at the time did not like the Magna Carta, and so a civil war broke out. Fast forward a bit to 1216, King John dies to dysentery. Fast forward a lot to 1455, and England is in yet another civil war. A war between the House of York and the House of Lancaster for the throne of England. So yeah, they really wanted that throne. This is where 29-year-old King Henry VII comes into play. Henry, part of the Lancaster family, decides to marry Elizabeth of York. And because someone of the Lancaster and someone of the York marry, this causes the opposing sides to stop conflict. The families amalgamate into the Tudor dynasty. King Henry VII's reign was nothing out of the ordinary. He started a couple wars with France, made peace with France, and made peace with Scotland by marrying off his children. He would die from tuberculosis in 1509, having a relatively normal rule. King Henry VIII, King Henry VII's successor. The son of King Henry VII, Henry VIII, notorious for his mistresses. After the death of his brother, he married his widowed wife, Catherine of Aragon. The purpose of their marriage was thought to maintain their diplomacy with Spain. Great things were expected of Henry VIII, likely due to his father's reign. So imagine his frustration when out of 6 children, only 1 survived infancy, and that child was a girl. This was bad for Henry because only a male could inherit the throne. Henry was not a loyal man by any means. He had many mistresses during their marriage, but one woman particularly caught his attention, Anne Boleyn, his wife's maid. Henry would try divorcing Catherine to marry Anne, but at the time divorce was something only the Pope could allow. So he tried convincing the Pope that his marriage with Catherine was sinful because she was the widow of his brother. Catherine tried fighting against this, but in the end she would be separated from her throne and her daughter, dying alone and isolated from cancer in 1536. 3 years prior, Anne and Henry had already married. He would also make sure his daughter, Mary, would be declared illegitimate. In 1533, Anne had Princess Elizabeth and would fail to make an heir. This was believed to cause stress for Henry as he began to doubt his decision on marrying Anne. Henry's courtiers would accuse Anne of adultery, incest, and treason. She'd be found guilty. She would be executed by decapitation in 1536. 11 days after her execution, Henry remarried to Jane Seymour. Similar to Anne, Jane would only accept Henry's advances through marriage. This could be another reason why Anne was executed. On October 12, 1537, their son Edward would be born, Henry's first heir. Unfortunately, Jane would die just 12 days later from a fever. Jane was thought to be Henry's favorite wife, because he actually mourned her and waited 2 years before remarrying. In 1540, Henry got engaged with Anne of Cleves for diplomatic reasons. They met on January 1st. Henry was disappointed to say the least. As to him, she looked prettier in the paintings. So later, their marriage was cancelled considerably peacefully. 19 days after their annulment, Henry fell in love with one of Anne's maids, Catherine Howard. They married on July 28th. In 1541, Henry would discover Catherine has had affairs during their engagement. So inevitably, Catherine was beheaded just a day before Valentine's Day. In 1543, Henry would marry Catherine Parr, and this time she would outlive Henry. She also put Mary and Elizabeth back into the line of succession. Meet King Henry VI, crowned as king at the ripe age of 9. He was thought to be a gifted boy, being both athletically and academically skilled. In 1553, Edward showed signs of tuberculosis, and by May it was evident that it was fatal. He made sure to tell his regency to remove Mary and Elizabeth from the line of succession and have Lady Jane Grey be his successor. This was likely because Lady Jane Grey was a devout Protestant. Lady Jane Grey would rule for 9 days before Mary had her arrested and executed for treason, believing the throne should have been hers. Then Mary ruled for 5 years, persecuting Protestants and desperately trying to have children with Prince Philip of Spain. Eventually, the two ended up together but failed to have any children, and Philip lost interest in her. It's important to note that Mary was actually the very first female ruler of England and Ireland. Then, in 1558, she would pass away supposedly due to natural causes. This would leave the throne to Elizabeth, who was a Protestant and a fan of William Shakespeare. Prince Philip didn't really like Elizabeth due to their opposing religions, inevitably leading to a war between the two nations. England would win, finally pushing Philip away. Elizabeth was best known for her appreciation of arts and virginity, as she never married. She would pass away in 1603 due to unknown reasons. People suspect it was lead poisoning, but there isn't an actual answer. James's mother, Mary of Scotland, abdicated in 1567, giving the throne to 1-year-old James. In 1603, after Elizabeth's death, he would receive rulership over England since they had good diplomacy, also because they were relatives. Soon after his crowning, he married Queen Anne of Denmark, and they'd have 7 children, 3 of which survived infancy. His reign was a considerably peaceful one. James tried reconciling the Protestants and the Catholics and actively encouraged music and literature. He also loved partaking in witch hunts and conducted many personal hunts on his own. Just a little side hobby, one could say. He was also rumored to be homosexual and suspected of having several male partners. However, he stated things that very clearly contradict these claims. He died quietly in 1625 from dysentery, with his son Charles by his side. Charles was the second son of King James, and the only one to live to adulthood. He was thought to be a sickly child as he had a leg brace and a stutter. He became King of England, Ireland, and Scotland in 1625, officially crowned in 1626. He would marry 15-year-old Henrietta Maria of France just a few months later. They'd have 9 children, 5 surviving infancy. Taking after his dad, Charles was a strong believer in absolutism and believed he was above the Parliament. The Parliament and Charles got into many disagreements, one being that Charles should be the one to collect the tax money instead of the Parliament. These conflicts evolved into the Bishops' Wars, basically Charles versus the people of Scotland. The Parliament took notice of Charles's behavior and made him sign the Petition of Rights. This contract would make Charles agree to the following terms: no taxing without the Parliament's consent, no unjust imprisonment, no soldiers quartering in homes without consent, and no more martial law. He very reluctantly ratified this contract. In 1629, Charles replaces the Parliament with his personal rule, so in short, he formed his own council that managed his regions for 11 years. He would also try promoting controversial topics such as Anglicanism. This led to inevitable battles. In 1640, these conflicts got so intense that Charles actually, for once, takes accountability. He reassembled the former Parliament. He asked them to try and mediate things, which they surprisingly agreed to. The Parliament came back and told Charles that the problems rooted from Charles's irresponsibility and ignorance to their contract. Charles felt his power as king was being threatened by this and refused to accept these terms. This would mark the start of the Long Parliament, a period where, in short, Charles resisted the Parliament and his people. 2 years later, in 1642, a civil war would break out between Charles and the Parliament. Oliver Cromwell was an army general, and all those supporting the Parliament would follow him. They were called the Roundheads. Charles gathered royalists, who were cavaliers, basically people with weapons and horses, with noticeably less protective gear. The war would end in around 1651, with Cromwell and the Roundheads victorious. Two years prior, in 1649, Charles would finally be arrested and have a trial for all of his crimes. The Pride's Purge was an event where members of the Parliament had to fend off people who opposed the king's trial. Charles would have his trial take place in the High Court of Justice, his judge being Lord President Bradshaw. Most of the trial went back and forth, just Charles questioning the logic of this trial while Bradshaw couldn't answer him. During this time, in place of Charles, the Rump Parliament was managing England. The Rump Parliament consisted of people in favor of the king's trial. This trial was revolutionary, as it introduced the idea that the people of a nation could have authority over their monarch. He was found guilty and beheaded on January 30th. Again, an execution of a monarch was unheard of at this time. In 1653, Cromwell would ascend to the throne under the title Lord Protector Cromwell. He would rule for 5 years, having a very controversial Republican. His reign would end after his death in 1658. Naturally, the next ruler would be Richard, Cromwell's son. Unfortunately, however, he lacked many qualities his father had. He wasn't experienced with the military, wasn't really prepared for the position either, and lacked support from everyone, really. So he was pressured to resign. This sent England into a spiral. Without a ruler, they were extremely lost and confused. That is, until Charles's son came forward and stated that if he was allowed the position of monarch, he would make the following promises. Everyone who opposed his father would be pardoned, most at least. Religious freedom would be allowed to an extent, but no persecution, and he would work with the Parliament. He was eventually accepted as king, and the monarch was swiftly brought back. For a while, England had been divided by Protestants and Catholics. Catholics would soon grow smaller, and Charles would take advantage of this. He would enforce a new rule that gave Catholics less opportunity, a law that would prevent any Catholic from getting a more serious job. The Test Act in 1673, where if you wanted to apply for a job, you must prove you're not a Catholic. The first test was making an oath to prove your loyalty to Protestantism. This could be done by recognizing the monarch as your ruler. The second would be stating that you don't believe in transubstantiation. Eventually, Charles would die in 1685, leaving the throne to his brother, James. James II was Catholic and wished to bring back Catholicism, or at least have it tolerated. In 1688, he would come to realize that this made him a target. Nobody supported these ideas, so he fled and pretty much resigned his position. This is also known as the Glorious Revolution, a time where, since the Parliament didn't approve of James's religion, they invited his son-in-law to invade his country. But James knew that this was a battle he could not win, so he immediately surrendered his position. Mary, James's daughter, and William, her husband, would then ascend to the throne and sign the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was a contract that ensured a more balanced power between a monarch and their people. This is also an extremely significant event. This marks the end of our timeline.